Welcome to the Morty Vicar podcast. I'm Wayne.
I'm James.
James, what are we talking about today? Oh, well, actually, Morty Vicar is culture, theology, and life. We must listen back and check. I don't know if our standard...
Yeah, on the podcast intro, it does have that, and then we say it again. But on the YouTube intro, it doesn't. So you've heard that probably 3 times already now. Welcome. Hi. We've been away for a couple of days.
Yeah. We've been... where have we been?
We went to Newcastle.
Can you say it in a Geordie accent?
No.
If you're one of our international listeners, Newcastle is... I'm laughing because I'm just imagining we have one international listener. Is in the north of our country, so we had to fly there.
We did,
and there's a whole experience. There's a whole podcast on why Bristol Airport for such a small city is like a is like a hub.
Likely to put you to sleep quicker than this one. But anyway, this week we're talking about stories and theology, but in particular we're talking about a cultural issue within the church. So generally speaking, we'll talk about culture as in the way things work in the society in which we live, predominantly here in the United Kingdom as part of what might be termed the West.
Yeah.
But today we're looking at an issue that's emerging within the culture of the church within the West.
So there's cultures across the world and across history can have lots of sharp differences, but the one thing that is kind of common across them all is that in order to understand yourself and in order to understand your place in the world and understand why the world is the way it is that cultures tell stories.
Yeah.
And if you want to communicate anything to anybody, the best way to do that is through story. The best way to sell anything to anybody is through stories. So stories have always been the most powerful way for human beings to learn, to remember, and to be changed.
Yeah.
And so you started us off on this because you thought there's in the church in the West, there are different stories that are being shared or not shared that actually aren't consistent with one another. Is that right?
Yes. So we recently applied for some funding for one of the outreach programs that we run here at BNA, and the request was for our diversity and inclusion policy. Do we have one? And immediately I was thinking, well, I wonder what they'll be interested in reading in our diversity and inclusion policy, because churches can have those and say largely the same thing, but then underneath it have very different ethical positions. And so we're in churches where it's possible for people to be present who have come with different sexual orientations and different religious and ethnic backgrounds, but have those churches could have very different positions on what it means for those people to be saved and what it means for their lives to be transformed.
But also very different understandings. Like you could have 2 churches that say, welcome, Sundays, 10 o'clock. And different people will understand that word welcome very differently.
Yeah.
And that, so we talk about culture, but you talk about being in the West, and in the West we're thinking about postmodernity.
Yeah.
And that is we've talked about this before, but that's because we're downstream from a philosophical movement that said that language is kind of far more flexible than it would have been thought of 150 years ago.
Yeah.
And so you talked about DUI policy. So no, that's drunk.
Driving under the influence.
Driving under the influence.
No.
Diversity.
EDI.
EDI. Sorry. I didn't get.
We got back very late last night.
But a word like inclusion is a word that in different spaces means different things, and that's because postmodernity says you get to decide what a word means, not the person who spoke it.
Yeah.
But the problem is the person who spoke it is also deciding what it means. So then you have all these terms and all these things like even like welcome that is bandied around, and everybody has a different understanding of.
Yeah. So very practically, what that means for you as a listener, if you're in a place of work or hanging out with a family, you could be alongside people who are not Christians and alongside people who are Christians, and your experience of church in terms of those issues around diversity and inclusion can be language that you can inhabit and share, but then you could be a part of churches that are experiencing that very differently. So, I mean, the kind of flagship churches, I guess, would probably be, if you think about St Martin in the Fields in London, that would be an example of a church that would describe itself as radically inclusive for those of any sexual orientation and those of any ethnicity or religious background. But yet there would be other churches in London that would say the same thing, but that would come to a different view on issues of sexuality and sexual identity in practice, and what that means in terms of welcome. Also, what it means for somebody to be saved from a Muslim background or a Hindu background.
You could have a Church of England minister who, when talking about interfaith dialogue, so talking to people from other faiths, has a view that actually, when I'm talking to somebody who's a Buddhist or a Muslim, that actually my heart is to share Jesus for them to convert.
Yeah.
And you can also have a Church of England minister who would find that statement very offensive because you're asking somebody to convert from their religion and you shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And they could both be Christian ministers.
Yeah.
And that's quite a complex thing. And then all the while in the background, because we were joking, and there's some real lives involved in this, so I shouldn't be sort of saying we were joking, but we were joking about how, like, in the church that's in the news at the moment is a sleepy village church where a vicar has tried to bring in some changes that, as far as I can see, seem to be the kind of policies that we should all be following as vicars around
safeguarding
and agreements. But because it's a sleepy village church, they're all resisting it.
Yeah.
And this is dreadful for the church. And there is still this kind of, even though we're in this kind of post-Christendom world, the memory of the church is neither St Martin in Fields or the church that might use similar terms but means differently. The memory in the country is of 40 people in a village like the Vicar of Dibley still.
Yeah. Okay. So this is not out there, it's here. These are the kinds of conversations that either we're having or we're going to be having soon, because we are in the middle probably of a 100-year-long reformation that's going on in the church in the West around what it thinks about salvation and what it thinks about life transformation.
So explain that for somebody. So you've got Christian theology, and you've just said a 100-year Reformation. The first Reformation, we celebrated the 500th of it a couple of years ago. There's a forming of the early church. Explain what you mean by the fact that we're in this.
So it's the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea, which was the first of two really significant councils held by the church, essentially when it was able to meet, because it had been underground for a couple of hundred years. And they got together to discuss essentially the identity of God and to form a creedal position. And the
big debate of the day was?
Whether Jesus was fully God and fully man. Or whether he was some kind of, in the technical term is demiurge, so an intermediary between humanity and God.
Quickly, this is a really, I think, interesting point for where we're going to go, is the demiurge is a phrase that had been borrowed from Greek culture.
Yeah.
So actually it was part of a Greek and a Gnostic understanding of how the world and spirituality is that had been brought into the church and was being used to describe Jesus. That, I think, will become useful later.
You've got in the 4th century, there's all of this debating going on. Nowhere near as, there's no X or social media platforms for them to debate.
No, they literally just burnt each other and imprisoned
each other out of churches. So
the social media battles are quite minor.
Two main proponents are guys called Arius and Athanasius. I think they come from the same church, actually, in Egypt. I think the fable is that one of them baptized the other, and was that baptism is it efficacious, or did it work?
Yeah.
Probably made up a word there, not surprising.
Efficacy.
What was the efficacy of that baptism? If Arius was a heretic baptizing Athanasius. So that debate is going on in the 4th century, and it's essentially resolved. It takes is it 60 years to the Second Council?
Chalcedon.
Yeah.
Because that moves on to the third person of the Trinity.
Yeah.
Um,
So there's about 100 years to work out the identity of God, and the Christian in the 4th century largely isn't aware of this, but actually Eris was apparently he's a very effective church planter.
Apparently, yeah.
So the gospel's
spreading
around heresy about the identity of Jesus.
But the interesting thing, so it's about the identity of Jesus. Is he and the point, the Eris point is that he wasn't. He couldn't be fully God and fully man, and that he was doubting the full humanity of Jesus. This is really important. And Athanasius comes along and goes, well, if for Jesus to die in our place, which is the kind of core of the gospel, that Jesus takes the curse of sin upon himself as the second Adam, fully human. If that's going to happen, he has to be fully human. And Athanasius has this beautiful phrase: "What is not assumed is not healed." And his challenge back to Eris is if you make Jesus a demiurge, you make him somehow below God, but also somehow not quite fully human. How does he save us? Because in order to save us, he has to be both fully God and fully man.
Yes.
And that's the mystery of the incarnation. But it's what's going on is Arius is, without fully realizing it, is kind of pulling a key plank of the gospel out from under itself. In that God in human form comes and dies in our place, substitutionary atonement, taking our sin upon himself, and it's the sin he doesn't deserve, and because of that he's then able to defeat death. And what Arius does is just pull that key plank, and Athanasius goes, hold on a second, if that's what we now believe, the gospel actually doesn't work.
So a major social event, Constantine becoming a Christian, enables Christianity
Emperor
to become public, then enables Christianity to be understood in a more universal way. Fast forward a few hundred years, you've got another social event. So essentially, the discoveries of the Americas and trade
about 1,000 years, James.
Yeah. Sorry. And then actually, there's the beginnings of something going on there around the translation of the Bible, because we're suddenly aware that the Bible needs to make its way out of Latin and into other languages ahead of a move of the Spirit where it begins to make its way into other languages as it travels around the world. So there's this kind of social event that then, as people begin to translate the Bible, they begin to see meanings that have been hidden in the Catholic Church, and then there's the rediscovery of what it means for us to be saved by grace through faith.
Yeah, this is where culture actually is really useful, because the Reformation follows the back of the Renaissance, and one of the key things in the Renaissance is the rediscovery of old things that have been lost. So like Michelangelo used to wander the ruins in Rome trying to work out how they did what they did, because they didn't know anymore. And it's that bit, it's this kind of, Erasmus is the dude, isn't he? The dude. But it's this kind of rediscovery of the importance of the original language, Greek and Hebrew, and studying that. And it's in studying that. And interesting enough, it's not just Luther being the most important people, the people who he's most famous, who start studying it, start reading the scriptures.
Yeah, and so they start questioning the theology. So there is a reforming of the church's theology.
So if in the 4th century the wrong theology that was damaging the gospel was the fact that Jesus wasn't fully human nor fully God, but was something in between, what's the wrong theology at the Reformation?
That salvation can be earned by our righteousness, and Luther in his works on Romans, and actually a lot of his work was influenced by the theologians that came after Athanasius, like Augustine, is asserting that actually there's a righteousness of our that is apart from the law, that comes in Jesus. So there's
which is also discovered Contarini, wasn't it? There was an Italian who remained. There was the Catholic Counter-Reformation. This was this move that grew up where all these people were like.
So there's a there's a Bible that sits just behind there in a suitcase. That's the Treacle Bible was one of the Bibles that was sent to churches around this country. I think in the 1570s. So there's a whole century and more of theological debate around what it means for us to be to be made righteous and how that happens. And then out of that comes a whole kind of reforming of church. But that's the kind of the central doctrine.
And what's happening and going on in history is you've got the gospel, people understand the gospel, and they're kind of headed towards the gospel. And then, but we're rooted in culture, like the waters that we swim in, as it were. And actually what happens is the tides of culture kind of just blow us along a bit. So I'm thinking about back where I grew up, you could be sailing across the harbour, but there's a point when you sail across Cork Harbour where you cross the river Lee as it flows through the harbour and out to the sea. And at that point, if you're just sailing, not only will the wind be moving you, but the flow of the tide starts moving you in a new way. And what you've then got to do is you've got to fix your eyes on where you were headed and adjust your course to make sure that you don't go off course. And this is what happens in history, is that the kind of the tide of culture kind of can blow the church off course, and then suddenly somebody pops up and goes, "Ooh, we're getting the gospel wrong."
Yeah.
Now let's I wonder if we do the 100 years, and you tell me where culture's been changing in the last 100 years around post-modernity, and then how we think that might be affecting the gospel.
Yes.
And if you get it wrong, I'll correct you.
It's really difficult to do because we're in it.
Yeah, we're in it. Okay.
And so
was Athanasius, and so was
Yes,
Luther.
I know. So
I'm going to push you.
No. I'm not saying we're not going to do it. I'm just saying it is harder for us to see this about ourselves in a way that. In 100 years' time, people will be able to summarize it a little bit more clearly than we might. So essentially, the statement "God is love" is under question.
Yes.
Is he a good God? And if he is a God of love, what does that mean? And so the previous work of the Reformation around what it means for us to be righteous, as far as those of us who hold dear to the work of the Reformation, cannot be disconnected from what it means for him to be love. But for those who hold less dear to the Reformed theology that comes out of the Reformation, they would say that the statement "God is love" is a universal statement and requires nothing of us in terms of our life change in response to the consent that God is love.
Okay, so if we push into that, no, that's good. But if we push into that, the philosophical understanding behind it is all about the source of identity.
Yes.
So post-modernity, coming out of modernity, says that the source of your identity, who you are, is rooted in you. And the choices you make and the decisions you make and your feelings and your emotions. And
so it's no longer your nationality, your tribe, or something that's given to you by your parents.
Identity is not received, it's chosen. And so if you have that philosophical understanding and I say to you, you are loved, and I agree with your philosophical understanding, I'm saying that identity that you have chosen is loved. Now, if you hold to a more kind of, I suppose, dare I say it, the vast majority of human history on this planet understanding that actually who we are is received, within Christianity we understand that it's received from God, but actually sometimes it's, as you said, in modernity, like if you think about the start of the First World War, nationality, if I say you are loved, but it comes at me a different way, because actually it's not coming at saying everything that you've chosen about yourself. It's saying something else about it, and that's I think that's the nub of the philosophical thing at the moment, which is who's in charge of who I am. That's the question.
Yes. So, am I at the centre of the universe, or is God at the centre of the universe?
And a voice like Tim Keller, who passed away a couple of years ago, would say that's the question that all humanity's been asking since the garden, and deciding and trying their best to put themselves at the centre of the universe.
Yes.
And so, interesting enough, even though we might say, oh, this is a very postmodern thing and the end of the 20th century, 21st century thing, it's the same question humans have been asking since the garden.
So, moving on to a bit more of the theology. This week we saw something about Pride, the event, and Christianity, and there was a Christian speaking about Pride and was speaking about what it means for people to be loved. And in the statement "you are loved," there is nothing with which we would disagree.
Nope.
But the surrounding ethical framework of pride
And how that person unpacked that statement.
would imply that love requires no response in order for it to be completed, and requires no continuing life change.
Now, so that if I was from that camp, which they would push back and go, well, we do expect life change, but and so they would want to push back on that a little bit, and they do, but that core thing is that your identity doesn't have to change.
Yes.
That core of who you are doesn't have to change.
Yes.
Okay? So come to Jesus, but the core of who you are doesn't have to change. Now, you're going to contrast that with Tuesday night, aren't you?
Yeah, so we were at a brilliant place on Tuesday night called Connect in Newcastle, and there were about 60 people in the room, and they were from all sorts of backgrounds, some of whom would find it really difficult to be in church.
Yeah. Common across them all is that actually their story, up until, for most of them, so we probably reckon anything up to 20% weren't yet Christians, but the ones who were Christians, their stories, by and large, were ones of brokenness, ones of pain, ones of identities that they weren't very happy with. Now, I've gotten into this one. What was interesting is I introduced myself to a lot of people, and their first answer back 3 times, I said, "Hi, I'm Wayne. What's your name? Tell me about yourself or something." Their first answer back 3 times was, "I became a Christian and then went."
Yeah, same for me.
And that implies that they have an understanding of their identity that's shifted.
Yep.
So, and they would agree with the statement, "You are loved."
Yeah.
And the reason that they know they're loved is that something's happened to them that's changed them completely. And we heard stories, and we can't really talk about these, and we're going to go on to that why in a second.
Yeah.
But that kind of blew your mind at the level of change that these people had experienced.
And then we heard a brilliant explanation of the gospel.
Yep.
And a brilliant explanation of life change from a wonderful speaker who spoke to them within the time frame that she was given.
Which, as you know, is something I struggle with.
But it was also, frankly, because some of them needed to get up because they couldn't stay seated for that long, and some of them needed to get out for a cigarette. And she was wonderful, and the understanding of life change and was wonderfully explained. She talked about the sinful nature being something that we no longer carry once we have given our lives to Jesus. And that when we mess up, because we will mess up, it is not that nature coming back. It is our minds being corrupted by sin, and that what we need to do is we need to take that to Jesus in his mercy and not pretend that we have gone back to an old way of living.
And this is the bit...
Oh, it's really good.
It was very, very good. And this is the bit that I think is where that potential, as you might call reformation-like conversations happening in the church, is the Jesus who says, unless you're born of the Spirit, you cannot see the kingdom of God. And Paul who says, if anyone's in Christ, he or she are a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come. It is that statement, you are loved, in a classical, orthodox, traditional Christian understanding is no matter what your identity is, no matter what your story has been, there is a God who loves you.
Yeah.
And that God loves you so much that he took your place in death for your sin. And what was really interesting is that group of people were a bunch of people who actually their sin, as it were, their shame was public. Everybody knew about it, as it were, because and in doing so, when you say yes to Jesus, you are born again by the Spirit. You're born from above, to use the technical Greek, and you become a new creation. You become a child of God.
Yeah.
And so you now have this new identity.
Yes.
And sin is not your identity.
Yes.
And then what she brilliantly said, so when you do mess up, and she's kind of admitted that we all do, and she told about herself, is that when we come back to God, it's not because he's cross with us.
Yeah.
And it's not because we have that old identity, because the Bible very clearly says born again,
Yeah.
born from above, new creation. It's that we're going back to the one who's loved us and has made us new to say, can you help me not to do that again?
Yeah.
And to which he goes, yeah.
Yes.
And it was just, and that's kind of, I don't know about it. Didn't care about anybody else in the room. I needed to hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But interesting enough, that is the bit of the gospel that in postmodern, post-Christian West is the bit that is being most challenged.
Yes.
That idea that you might need to, that your old self might need to die.
Yeah.
And that some of what needs to die in your old self is your identity.
Yes. And we have to be honest and recognise that there are parts of the church that still essentially preach another form of moralism, which is that Jesus has saved you, but you've got to look busy in between now and when he comes back.
Yeah. But we're not going. We can talk about that another day.
We just need to acknowledge that that's there. So yes. So 2 things that we heard this week. One, you're loved no matter what. Another, you're loved no matter what. One affirms the identity on the other end. The other says that identity, I want to relieve you of that and give you a new identity of what it means to be loved as a child of God. And you are now set free with me to walk into your new nature and your new identity. And that transpires itself in the conversations that we had where people were identifying themselves in relation to when they had become Christians and what it means for them now to follow Jesus.
And then the problem, let's go into the kind of problems of communication. Or well, Paul says this actually. He says, the message of the cross is foolishness. Foolishness to the Greeks, weakness to the Jews. And actually, that message that you're loved so much that God wants to change your identity sounds interesting. If it doesn't sound like foolishness or weakness to the modern, it sounds like control.
Yeah.
And so that's why the Western mind pushes back against that, because it sounds like you want to take me over. Yeah. You want to control me. And that's the but it's the message that probably is the most easily shared with the Western world, because the Western world, as in the one that isn't about control, because that's what the Western world wants to hear.
Yeah. So when we drill down into what this means for our lives, if we go back to those social settings or those professional settings where we're alongside people who don't believe and we're alongside people who do believe, but they might be on a different side in this reformation, when they're telling stories of what it means for someone to be loved and we're telling stories of what it means for someone to be loved, there's one thing to notice is that actually in the stories that we tell, we need to be really respectful of the identities of those people whose stories we tell, because we need to protect them because they're their stories, not our stories. Yep. And often there's a level of brokenness, or in some cases, as we alluded to earlier, with people coming from Muslim backgrounds, actually there's a level of danger involved in people's stories being told. But I think our simple answer as we sort of come into land is that actually the compelling bit is when we can tell our part in that story. So we're not just saying, I know some people, we're saying, and actually what I find is true is that I can see that I have handed over my sinful nature, and here are the places in my life where I am seeing change too.
Yeah. So it's that. So all churches should be full of communities where change is the norm, and where the journey of someone's life, no matter how long they've been following Jesus, is growth in, it's sanctification. It's becoming more and more like him, and change is part of that. And so actually we need to celebrate new life. Jesus says that there's more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents and 99 who doesn't need to, so we celebrate new life. But actually we need, all of us are invited into gospel lives in the power of the Spirit that are themselves testimonies and stories of change. And those are the stories that change culture. So your story, bumping up to the person in your office, is actually going to change the lives of the people in the office more than you going, there's somebody in church who walked off the street. That's a really cool thing to share, but actually it's when people see you and see, oh, your change, I'll see that you live differently to them, that they then begin to ask questions.
Yes. So shall I end by giving a little story from my life?
Yeah.
You can't say no at that point.
No.
So recently, I've realised that I placed my own identity and security in too much in those people around me who loved me. And when those relationships were put under the strain of illness and death, actually I had an opportunity to look to God for that security and to realise that was what was going on. But I didn't. And in that, I placed my security in my work and in my capacity to be who I needed to be, to perform. And as that was challenged, because I wasn't able to do that perfectly, I found myself more and more resistant to feedback because I didn't want that challenged. I didn't want my skill and my professionalism, where I had placed my security, to be challenged. And it's only in that kind of coming crashing down that I've realised that actually I was kind of almost trying to form I was trying to wake the dead man, in essence. I was trying to form my own righteousness. And it made it difficult for other people to say to me, actually, James, I think we need to think about this, and you might have got this wrong. And so part of the new life for me is being able to say, actually, I'm learning what it means to find my security in God and to find my identity in Him, not in my own stuff, so that actually even in this time of personal turmoil, I can welcome other people's feedback and hear what it's like to be on the end of me, rather than just crack on and pretend that everything's okay.
Cool, thank you.